Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wired's live living room sessions. If this is the first time that you're joining us, my name is Jenn Clarke from CPRI Barbados. Wired's Keisha Farnham and I have been hosting this space for disruptive and innovative conversations on climate change, biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and renewable energy. You can join in live every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. as our guest presenters will be taking live questions from you, our audience. Or you can always watch the replay on our respective Facebook pages, and our living room sessions are also now being streamed live to Wired's YouTube channel, so be sure to check us there and subscribe. Last week, Keisha had the pleasure of chatting with Israel Mapp, creative producer, architect, product designer, potter. They took a look at regenerative development and climate change out of the lens of a creative placemaking and urban spaces. I highly recommend you catch the recorded session on Wired's YouTube channel. The Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute, CPRI Barbados, is pleased to be partnering with Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design, WIRED, to bring you this series powered by the Inter-American Development Bank. And today, we are very pleased to welcome the Inter-American Development Bank's energy specialist, Veronica Prado. Veronica currently serves in the infrastructure and energy sector assigned to the Country Office of Barbados. Her main areas of work include energy efficiency, renewable energy, electric mobility, regulatory reform, and innovative financing mechanisms in the energy sector. I, for one, am very excited to learn more about the renewable energy sector and what it can mean for the near future of Barbados. So please join me in welcoming Veronica to our session today. Veronica, how are you?
Hello, Jen. How are you? Thank
Good.
you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Veronica, I gave everyone a little brief overview of your bio and what you do at the IDB. Would you like to elaborate a little more for our viewers on the work that you do and the role that you play within the energy sector?
So absolutely. Thank you. I have been living in Barbados for the past 2.5 years, and I'm responsible for developing projects and activities related to the energy sector here in Barbados. But I think my relationship in work in the energy sector in Barbados goes way beyond the 2.5 years, because the first time that I came here was about 7 years ago, when we were on the process of structuring one of the loans that's currently under execution. And I have had the pleasure to work in many different countries in the Caribbean region. So Barbados is home to me, and I'm very happy to be part of the transformative approach that we are trying to implement in the energy sector here.
Perfect, that's great. And so on transformative approaches, Barbados has a national energy policy, 2019 to 2030, which has some lofty goals to reach by the year 2030. We can all read through the policy and the implementation framework online, but to your average person, your everyday Bajan, small business person, ZR driver, your average everyday consumers of energy, it's a little confusing. So their questions are, how can we achieve 100% renewable energy by 2030? It's just 10 years away. How can we do that when we're so heavily reliant on fossil fuels right now? So in general, renewable energy is viewed as a bit of a futuristic model to the mass population. We do have some renewable energy options that are available right now. We have, in fact, been using more than your average person might think for quite a number of years. So if we can start by addressing the question of why renewable, can you paint us a picture of what the energy sector looks like in Barbados right now, and why do we need to make a change to renewable sources?
Okay, sure. I'll give you an overview, and if you need more details, feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask additional questions.
Perfect.
So why here, why now? I mean, I think it's a global trend, right? I think more and more countries are moving towards having a cleaner energy matrix. And why makes sense? It makes sense because it reduces the amount of emissions. Instead of burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, you will be using renewable sources like the wind, the sun, or water, in the case of hydro, or geothermal, the steam. So it makes a lot of sense from an environmental point of view. It makes a lot of sense in most of the cases from an energy security point of view, because most of the countries, which is the case of the Barbados and many other countries in the region, there's a huge dependence on imported fossil fuels.
Absolutely.
That's very problematic, and we are in the middle of a crisis now, a pandemic, and it is very complicated when you look not only at your energy sector but at your economy, and you see that it needs more diversification, and you wanted to do as much as you possibly can in order to reduce your external exposure or your dependence on other countries. It could be for energy, for food, or for just about anything.
Exactly. I was about to relate it to food because that's what brings it home to most people. So our food comes from overseas and we get that. But we need to remember that everything that we're relying on energy-wise currently comes from overseas. Not 100% of everything, but a lot.
Well, upwards to 95, 96%. So it makes a lot of sense for a security, strategy, environmental, and financially too, right? And I think that would bring lots of opportunities for businesses and for the population here to develop this sector. I think that's in a macro level, it makes a huge sense too, because there's a huge amount of financial volatility. So if you depend a lot on a specific commodity, in this case, oil, fossil fuels, from other countries, every time the prices fluctuate, we need to absorb that difference in price. So right now, for the past 3-4 months, we have had historical low prices in oil, but we know that it goes very high. That difference in prices is directly transferred to the customers. So we may enjoy a good moment now because the oil prices are low, but if the barrel goes up to 89, 100, what has been in the past years, then we need to absorb. And if you are trying to pay your electricity bill or develop businesses, you don't like that fluctuation, right? Because you need to be able to plan and to have consistency and to predict how you organize and how you go about your businesses. And the only way that we can address these instabilities that comes from being a net importer is by developing your own sector. I think that's all.
I think that's all. Absolutely. So in developing our own sector then, so what we need to do is we need to reframe and we need to bring this at home. We need to, similar to growing our own food, we need to grow our own electricity, our own energy as a total. It needs to be done from here at home. So to do that, some technology is needed, so leading into my next question, renewable energy is a very hot technology right now. There's lots of advancements that are being made in a lot of different ways. The pandemic, as you brought up, it's shedding a light on the fact that our misuse of our current resources is causing a lot of widespread problems. So there have been from fires to storms to global warming, and some are pointing out that including the pandemic itself is caused by a misuse of our current resources. So we've seen something very similar to this, not quite a pandemic. The world wars brought around the Industrial Revolution. My next question is, in order to achieve our 2030 goals, are we going to see a global innovation change similar to what we would have seen coming out of the end of the World War with the Industrial Revolution? Or is it going to be something more like financial availability that makes renewable energy more accessible in the long run and to small islands like Barbados?
Well, thank you for your question. So there's too many layers. I think probably I would have to take a few days to answer, but I'm going to try to concise this in just a few minutes. There's no shortage of technologies in the world today, and there's no shortage of capital ready to be invested in projects. Right. So that's why I'm going to take a step back. And there are many more new technologies that are currently being tested. But the fact that we are not implemented, or many other countries in the world that still do not have a very diversified and a cleaner energy matrix, is not because of necessarily the lack of capital and the lack of technologies. Okay, so we're going to take a step backwards. I think there's something that's called in policy making, in economics, in the world, that's called enabling environment. Okay, I think countries usually they need to have a very clear strategy on where they wanted to go. So what sort of targets, policies they wanted to design and put in place, right? That needs to be not only clear and communicated, but also you need to provide some certainty that that is going to take place, right? You wanted to institutionalize your objectives, your goals. And how do you do that? You do that through legislation and regulation. So, and we have had this, the policy that it was um, announced last year is one of the most ambitious in the world, but it's much better to be ambitious than not to, you know. And I tell you what, it's much more interesting on a daily basis to work for a government who wants to accomplish more than the average. It's very interesting because you see a lot of political will, a lot of desire to accomplish and to go as far as you possibly can go. So there's a lot of different pieces of the equation. It's not just the technology per se or the capital. It's how you bring that home, how you're able to deploy here. And countries, exactly, countries are different. They have different political and social dynamics. They have different perspectives on how they are going to roll out. If you look at throughout the world, the way you take the same technology and you deploy, it's different. It's different because people within that country, they may have different perspectives on how things should be adjusted to the local reality. And I think more and more we have an understanding of what's important for Barbados, how we would like this transformation in the sector to be something that everyone has a part in it. You know, it is possible to reach 100% renewable and to design a path to carbon neutrality. Absolutely. Are there enough technologies and funds in the world to support that? Yes. But there's also a cost and there is a homework that needs to be done home, and not necessarily by the policymakers, by the citizens. Because if you think about it, we also have options on buying a car that emit more or less CO2. We have an option to buy a piece of equipment that's more efficient than others. So, or to put our AC on and open the windows or not. So I think there's a lot to do, not only on what comes in terms of technology, but also how we deal with the technology and how we maximize the execution or the application of that.
That was great. I really, that was a very good answer to that question. In leading on from that question, I think I'm actually going to skip through to the next one. So you were talking a lot about developing a plan. So having your goals clearly set out. This relates to our question number 4, actually. So for our back end people, we're going to skip through. Can you, as a precursor to that question, could you walk us through what an integrated resource plan would look like for an island who is considering clean energy goals, and then why they should implement one or invest in one?
So in general, an integrated resource plan is basically how you look at all the different resources that you have, and you look at your time frame on how you're going to get there, and then you try to maximize, optimize. Usually it's made in a very specific way, the least cost. You look into the technologies, the least cost, and then you start implementing. And that, the idea of, it's basically planning. It's short, medium, and long planning. And usually it's not a static exercise.
Absolutely.
It's an exercise that should be revised as many times as needed, because sometimes the dynamics within each country may change. Imagine, especially in the Caribbean, you may have, unfortunately, a natural disaster and may cause some damage in the natural environment. You may need to make adjustments. Or in the case of the recession now, you may have to be able to go and make adjustments in case there is a huge drop in the cost of a specific technology. You need to go. So it's not a static document. Usually governments, they update every 2 years or every year. It depends on the dynamics of each country. So the idea really of having this plan, it's really to provide the clarity on how you go about developing this sector year by year, technology by technology, take into consideration all the different variables or elements that you may take. So, for example, here in Barbados, it's very specific because we have scarcity of, for example, water, right? We don't have rivers, so we cannot count with the hydro or run of the river or those base load technologies. So that's out of the question. We have to be very mindful on how the use of water can be involved in the development of any other technology. Land is very limited. We have one of the highest densities in the world. So there's a lot of people per square meter, square feet. So, and there's a competition on how you're going to use this space, if it's going to be for residential, industrial, agriculture, renewable energy. Usually you need substantial space, physical space, to develop wind farms. But there's a lot of approaches that in which you can cultivate some crops as you do. So there are many ways still that you can develop. However, it would be very hard, I would say, to reach 100% renewable energy just trying to deploy either distributed or utility scale solar PV. We need to go beyond that. There's a lot of studies now being undertaken by the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources. Here in Barbados, we are mapping the entire country on the wind, so we can move forward and develop wind projects. But even if you think about it, when you look at the island, it's still very small. If you want to reach, we would have to have a capacity of over 600 megawatts. We don't have enough land to cover with solar PV nor wind turbines. So we really need to be strategic about looking to the offshore. So there's a huge potential for offshore wind
farms,
either floating or fixed. The Inter-American Development Bank published a report about 2 or 3 months ago, giving an overview of all the different ocean or marine technologies that could be applicable to to Barbados, and that has a potential to be scalable and commercially viable. So there's a lot of potential for new technologies that we already know that are out there that can be implemented.
That's great. It's great to hear that there's definitely options out there, and keeping those, keeping the functions stacking is one of those things that we keep saying in permaculture specifically. So you mentioned that a few times. So I think we'll go back now for our back end people to question number 3. What we're looking at then is a number of different trends that are developing and coming through. What are some of the more popular things? You've mentioned wind farm, especially for Barbados, diversifying what you are using, but what are some of the more popular trends in the Caribbean and Barbados that we are seeing right now?
I mean, different countries, they have different paces, and many of the countries in the Caribbean region are now designing, many of the electric companies, they have had historically an integrated resource plan. But when you're designing integrated resource plans for the country, you're not thinking only about the generation of electricity. You're thinking about, for example, transport consumes upwards to 37% of the energy, or diesel and gasoline. So you need to find a solution on how you can transition that segment of the economy to a more cleaner and sustainable one. One of the trends that we have seen, not only in Barbados, but in many countries in the Caribbean and the world, is the electric vehicles. So it's very important. Barbados is the country in the Caribbean with the highest percentage of electric vehicle per person. We have over 400 electric vehicles here, and we have an extensive electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Besides Japan, I think Barbados is the only other country in the world that has more public charging infrastructure than gas stations. I think we have about 45 gas stations, and we have public network, I think it's upwards to 60, 65, and there are 400 plus electric vehicles, and most of the electric vehicles owners, they also have a charger at home.
Yeah.
So when you add the public infrastructure with the private, so
Yeah.
it's a few hundred EV chargers.
Mm-hmm.
So besides, there's a huge potential. I just wanted to say that there's this whole trend about electrifying different sectors of the economy. And transport, if we are going to look into carbon neutrality, reduction in CO2 emissions, sustainability, resilience, it's very important to address the consumption of fossil fuels in the transport sector. Before electrification, there's also alternative fuels, ethanol, biofuels, there are biodiesel. I'm originally from Brazil, and in Brazil for the past 20 years, we have had flex fuel cars. So you can either go and fill it up the tank with the gasoline or with ethanol or with a mix of it. Okay, it's a different story in Brazil because they have already designed a strategy and they have the skill, they have the space for cultivating the sugarcane. Here, because of the water scarcity and the land, the dynamics of producing ethanol is rather different. And I'm not sure to what extent import substitution would be the best way. You stop importing fossil fuel and you start importing something else. But what's more important is to identify alternatives and diversify, because you may not be able to produce locally enough ethanol or biodiesel to supply the entire fleet, but maybe you can address a small proportion. And that's very important, because that diversification is very important, and that's what we don't have now. Right? It's almost like all the eggs are in a single basket, and we wanted to have many different baskets, And I think why this whole diversification is very important. It's important because we live in a geographic area in the world that is very, unfortunately, susceptible to natural disasters. So resilience is very important. So distributed generation, diversifying with indigenous sources on your energy matrix, it is very important, because you need to break this cycle of having a completely dependent sector on the external dependence. So I think that's very important. So sorry that I went around a little bit on this, but in terms of technology and trends, there's a huge push on the electrification of the transport sector. I mean, there's still a lot of scope for solar, right? I mean, because if you look, especially in the Caribbean region, most of the countries are still extremely dependent and import fossil fuels, and they still have still low levels of renewable energy penetration within the sector. I mean, with a few exceptions, perhaps Suriname and Guyana, they have hydro, and they also is the dynamics of some Caribbean countries, because they're in the continent, they have interconnection, so it's different. But when you have an island, you don't have a physical interconnection. You're literally an island. And some countries in the Caribbean, despite still the dependency, they have more hydro, and some other countries, they have, here in the region, they have geothermal potential. So that's, unfortunately, it's not something that we have here, but some countries in the region, they do have. So there are many fronts that it can be developed, can be further explored, but in Barbados, all the different options are now on the table, and we are looking solar, distributed utility scale, electrification of the transportation sector, wind. There's this study that I just mentioned a few minutes ago on the marine energy, has a huge array of different technologies, some that are not commercially viable at this point, but we know that within the next few years will be commercially viable, and that could be applicable to our context. So there's a lot more to come. But before I go any further, I think we always talk about energy sector, implying putting more sustainability in cleaning the sector. We always think about putting more and renewable energy. We always think about the supply side, but there is a huge potential, and the cost of this side it's much lower, which is energy efficiency. You know, we
Yeah.
don't use what we have in the best or most efficient way. So there is a huge potential for making small investments and the next day start being able to collect the benefits.
On
So
the,
I
on
think
the on the homeowner's end, on the personal,
yes, I mean,
on the end user side.
I think at some point, maybe 10 years ago, I think Barbados was the country with the highest penetration of solar water heaters. It
Right.
is still one in the world, but there's still many households that do not have a solar water heater. And
Right.
usually the payback time is a couple of years. And
Mhm.
the moment you install, the next month, your electricity bill is going to be at least between 20 to 30% lower,
Mhm.
right? So of course it varies a little bit on the dynamics of each household, but the impact is immediate. If you have a more efficient refrigerator or different
Right.
appliances, if you are very careful in using your AC, if you barely use your AC, if you don't plug in five different cell phones and computers,
Yeah.
so there's a lot about how we use energy, and I think perhaps some of the good aspects of being at home and rethinking everything in this pandemic is how we can be more sensible on consuming and using things.
Absolutely.
And I think energy efficiency has a huge untapped potential.
Absolutely. And I think that this is a conversation that we have been having for a long time in terms of the education around energy efficiency. Um, but it seems as though there's in light of the pandemic, in light of our 2030 goals, it seems as though there's a change happening just even on the local level, on the homeowner's scale, in terms of the desire to be more energy efficient. It could be coming a little bit from the financial end of things, but um, as long as there's a change, there's a change. So I just want to let everybody who's joining us in today know that my name is Jenn Ward Clarke, and I'm actually here with Veronica Prado. She's the energy specialist at the IDB, and we are talking about all things renewable energy. We're taking questions live from the audience in a few minutes, so please post your questions below the discussion on our Facebook feed or on Wired's YouTube channel. Take a moment and copy and paste this link so that your friends can know that we're here chatting about the future of energy in Barbados, and they can join in as well, or you can always watch the replay if you've missed a bit of it on Facebook or YouTube. So Veronica, I have just one last question for you before we go to our live questions. We talked a lot about options. So there needing to be a change, there needing to be a diversification, that there needs to be more projects, there needs to be smaller, perhaps, smaller projects as opposed to, the largest wind farm on the earth or something like that. Will that be enough? Will financing options be enough to bring more projects online?
Mhm.
Or are we going to rely again on the innovation?
Yeah, it's a combination. It's not one or the other. I think it's both, right?
Right.
And also the approach. And I think one of the areas that's very important too is it's how institutions are set up and how the personnel are well trained to keep up with all the new technologies or with the innovative approaches, right? Because you may have the best technology at hand, but you're trying to implement in a very traditional or archaic
Right.
way. It doesn't match. So things needs to evolve together in a
Right.
very coordinated way. It's not never one or the other. It's both,
Both at the
right?
same time.
So I'm just going to give an example. I think the bank has, I'm going to do a little propaganda here since you
Yeah.
ask, because this is one of the, what we call the market failures that every time we design an activity, an operation, we try to address, right? Sometimes we ask, there's a lot, different technologies there. Why people are not installing more solar PV if it makes sense, if it's good for the environment, if it makes financial sense. And I understand that there are lots of businesses, for example, or households, they cannot access the credit, because they don't have a credit performance that would be acceptable to commercial banks, or because they really don't have the capital, even though they know it makes sense. But thinking about how we could address one of these market failures, we designed a project in which one of the elements of the project is called the Smart Fund, and it's a very well-known project here in Barbados, which is executed by the local fund, EGFL. So basically, it was a substantial amount of funds. It's about upwards to 13 million now that will be transferred to EGFL through the government of Barbados. And they're going to design loans for small, medium enterprises. And why to small, medium enterprises, especially targeting the hotel sector, the tourism sector? Because as I mentioned before, there's a huge untapped potential on energy efficiency across the board. If you look at all businesses, electricity cost is one of the highest operational costs. If they can lower that, they become more competitive automatically. And there's a huge potential because the energy intensity of hotels, of the tourism sector, is very high. So, and you would be surprised. I'm not even talking about small hotels. I'm talking about bigger hotels. A lot of people leave the room, leave the AC on, leave all the lights on, and there's no digital or anything that would, after a few seconds, that they detect that there's no one in the room, that would turn off automatically. So once you're able to put some digital elements into this, so you become more efficient. So it's a combination of things. So, but this fund was created to make loans to small, medium enterprise so they can invest in energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And there's a huge component that's very important. There's an element of technical assistance, because usually in order for you to design a well thought from a technical and a financial point of view project, you need to have some details on the patterns of energy consumption, future use, what you're trying to achieve. And usually you need something that's called energy audit, that someone goes and inspect your business or your house very carefully. They see everything that you have in terms of equipment, how you're using, how many people live in the house, or if your businesses. So you're trying to understand that specific ecosystem. And once you understand, you come up with a very strategic plan on what sort of technologies, mix of technologies you can implement in order to achieve, I don't know, 30% savings, 40% savings. You can design, or some buildings can go net zero. Okay, I wanted to design a strategy and intervention that I'm going to become a net zero, meaning I'm going to produce as much energy as I use. So you can do that. Or I have enough space, I can install enough solar PV and I can sell to the grid and make up for some of the investments. On top of that, I am going to install energy efficient lighting. I'm going to switch my equipment. And because of that, I'm going to have another 30% savings. And that's across the board. That's more or less how much you can harness in terms of energy efficiency, savings, energy savings, and financial savings.
Yeah.
It's overnight, right? So this has been a very successful project, and it has helped many small businesses that may not have the best financial situation to go and access funds from a commercial bank. So they are able to access, because there's a lot more flexibility on how they are seen. And because this program was designed to really capture those businesses that are not being able to break this vicious cycle.
Right.
So that's a very good example. So, and what we did, we mixed financing with some grant funding. So, and that provides a huge incentive for businesses to embark. And that has a substantial lower interest rate, and the repayment period is much longer,
Right.
right? So
Makes it a much more
innovative
viable option.
innovative financial mechanisms, it's very important, and I'm just gonna, and I sometimes when I talk to commercial banks, I always ask, because right now commercial banks, they lend funds to people who wanted to develop any renewable energy project, right? But the structure or how you recover your investment on a solar, it's going to be completely different than wind, and which is going to be completely different if you do storage or everything else. So I always said, you cannot deal with innovative technologies using the traditional financial mechanisms that you have. If you are trying to finance something that's innovative in its nature, you need to apply uh, and the banks are very conservative. Of course, you need to make sure that you design a financial mechanism in which you de-risk your finance and you recover, right? You don't want to design something that's completely innovative and that you're not sure if you're going to, the clients are going to repay. You need to make sure that you design something that it's innovative, that's accessible, and you're going to have the repayment. But I still think there's a huge way to go. Perhaps banks should look into providing more assistance and supporting the clients to design the intervention, but that requires a different set of skills that's not necessarily financial. It's more technical, and to see how they can maximize the different uses of technologies in order to get the best out of it. And also to design things that are more tailor-made, because one size does not fit all. If we want more people to be developing projects and access capital to develop projects, they need to have options. And I'm afraid all of the options that should be in the market are not there yet.
Not yet. We're getting there.
Getting there,
It sounds like you've given us some pretty good options there today, and it seems like while we have a way to go, we do have things are moving forward, and we are making progress on the innovation side, on the finance side, lots of different areas. So we have a number of questions from our audience today, so we want to make sure that we engage with everybody. We have users on YouTube and on Facebook, so if we can have our first question from the audience. This one is from Farn UK01. As COVID-19 continues to impact livelihoods and economies, what are the implications for the clean energy market in the Caribbean?
Well, there are many implications, and for me, I think everyone is trying to understand the different implications and how things can be solved, right? I think things there's really not going back to where it used to be.
Absolutely.
And I think where people see a problem, I always tend to see an opportunity. I think, for example, we have been having lots of discussions on how you can design activities or projects or programs that can stimulate the economic growth, right? So I think renewable energy is one, because it would make sense because of what I just said, because of the financial, environmental, social gains, and because would generate employment, right? Especially in a construction period, would generate a lot of once the projects are built, the installations, you still would need professionals for the maintenance and so on. But I do believe there's a huge potential to develop the sector. Everything remains to be done, and renewable energy efficiency is always a good option, because once you can generate a lot of employment, it would make sense in terms of reducing the financial burden, especially on foreign exchange and so on. So I think pursuing at this point renewable energy projects would bring so many different benefits.
Absolutely. Let's get them online. Let's get people employed. Let's get people saving money. It seems to make so much sense moving forward. Absolutely. Do we have another question from our audience here? So our next question is from Mel. Would a small farmer wanting to do biofuel benefit from the EGFL fund?
Um, I would invite you to go and look at the EGFL website, and there's the eligibility criteria. It's all there, right? You need to have a business. It's for businesses. It doesn't matter if it's a farm. You need to have it's not for households or private owners. It needs to be for a business.
Right.
But I believe so, and I think developing biofuels or biomass would be very important because, as you know, it's base load, it's not intermittent renewable energy, and it would be very valuable for the energy matrix and in Barbados as we move forward.
Perfect. That's great to hear. We have another question from our audience. It looks like it's from Sonia Grant. What about waste to energy technology? Can that be funded as well? That's a good one.
Yes, absolutely. And I would like to see a waste to energy project here in Barbados because, again, it's a base load. And also, we do have, I think, there's an issue also with the waste that's generated, right? I think the facility where the waste is dumped, it's near to its limits. So why not to take something that you have not necessarily more space to put it and transform in energy, clean energy that you very much needed. So I would like to see, and I think those projects on a small scale, biofuels or waste to energy, it is very important because especially if you have in different locations of the island, and also because you wanted to incentivize small owners or cooperatives. And I think that's all very important for this transition to a cleaner sector. It's very important.
Waste to energy is definitely something that we look at in permaculture, and on a small scale, we are looking to, at our Walker's Reserve site, in the very near future, as part of our UNDP project, to implement a biodigester to create cooking gas on a small scale. It's a home scale type option, but we hope to have that available to show what it can produce in the near future, perhaps by the end of this year, if we're lucky.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Do we have another question from the audience? So Vindra, 100% renewable for an island is only achievable with storage. That's a question. So she's asking, is it only achievable with storage on an island?
I mean, it depends. Iceland, it's an island, but they have 100% geothermal. So depend which island, and depend in the composition of the resources of each specific island. In the case of Barbados, most likely it would be you will need storage, not all mostly to stabilize the frequency and the grid, because you have all this intermittent energy, electricity coming to the grid. So you would need storage, battery storage for, yes, you would need, in the case of Barbados, would be essential. I don't see how we could have highest levels of penetration of renewable without having battery storage.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure what's the proportion. Yes, I think we're designing lots of different strategies, and that's where the integrated resource and resilience plan comes in, because you not only look at the different options in terms of technologies that you have, but the cost at that specific time, and should you do this project today or in 2 years from now, 3 years from now, what are the other options in the interim? So how that reflects in terms of the cost structure. So all of these elements are being taken into consideration. But in the case of Barbados, yes, I think would be impossible to have 100% electricity or renewable energy matrix without storage.
And for some reason, so not for some reason, but I do know that in a lot of conversations that we've had in the past, storage is a scary option. The fact that you then have to have a battery, which adds another layer to your to the whole system as a whole. It seems to be a drawback in a lot of people's minds. But when you flip the conversation into disaster, if you're looking at resiliency within the disaster spectrum of things, if you don't have your diversification in types of electricity or types of power that you're producing and storage combined, you're putting yourself at a serious risk, especially in an island like Barbados, because the minute one thing goes wrong, you've now lost all of it again. And without the storage, you have no backup whatsoever. So.
Well, it's not only your plan A, because it needs to be part of your matrix, but also it's your plan B, because you need to have a backup, you know. And I think last year, for the first time in many people's lives, we experienced a blackout for 2 days, and many businesses they couldn't operate because they didn't have a backup. So there's a utility scale, the big projects on the storage. You can have behind the meter, you can have at the distributed level, just to make your house or your businesses more resilient. I think it's yes, there's some drawbacks because of security issues, but it's so many other technologies. So it's all about trade-offs and what are the options in which you can adopt to achieve your goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So, and we have lots of questions to answer today. It seems like we have lots of engagement from our users. So if we can have our next question. This user is from YouTube. Thank you to everybody on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe while you are there. Tyler Bell, is there any feasibility for wave energy usage?
Yes. I mean, if you look at this study that I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, it's posted in the Ministry of Energy here in Barbados and also in the banks, and I can always share a link later. But it talks about the different ocean or marine technologies that will be suitable for Barbados and some other islands in the Caribbean. There are many technologies, but it's more so at the price point that would make sense. And there's some technologies that you would need in order to be economically viable. You would need to develop larger projects. So that's where the scale comes up, right? So if we decided to do a project on marine energy and the price point is too high, perhaps the only way that we could do it is developing as a region. Now we would take a few countries in the region, identify a suitable site, and it'll be shared, because then you can do a much larger, substantial project and share the costs and share the benefits. And sometimes smaller projects, because of the lack of scale, they become economically non-viable. But yes, there's a huge potential for developing some technologies related to wave, but also many others on ocean or marine energy. And I have been working closely with some experts from the Caribbean Development Bank, and we're doing also a mapping for the whole region, because there's some Eastern Caribbean islands are not necessarily country members of the IDB. But what we do, we make a partnership with the Caribbean Development Bank, and then we are able to include all the other Eastern Caribbean islands that are not necessarily country members of the IDB, but that are from the CDB. And some of these studies are including many of the other islands in the Caribbean with potential.
Perfect. That's great. It's great to hear that all of that is going on. We have lots more questions. So let's, Chad from Facebook would like to know, what advice would you give to a country like Trinidad and Tobago, whose economy is oil and gas based, to seriously invest in renewable energy?
I mean, the bank has an office in Trinidad, and I do have lots of colleagues, not only working with the private sector in Trinidad, and also working with the government in order to design some policy and regulations and targets to develop the renewable energy. You have been blessed for many years because you could access oil and gas. But diversifying, as I say, it's very important not to have a sector that's resilient, that's diversified. It has been problematic for even for the macroeconomic sustainability of the country. So there's a huge potential, and Trinidad for developing the renewables. There is a huge potential for energy efficiency. The greatest issue is that whereas in many Caribbean islands, the price of electricity are the highest in the world, the price of electricity in Trinidad is extremely low. So there's very little incentive to be efficient. So I think energy efficiency has a huge potential in Trinidad, so renewable energy, but I think there's some structural adjustments that I would have to be made, especially in the price of electricity to reflect the real cost of generating that electricity.
Right. Excellent. So we have lots more questions as well. Just to remind everybody that I am here with Veronica Prado. She is the energy specialist at the IDB, and we are talking about all kinds of different renewable energy sources, financing. We're taking questions live from the audience, so post your questions in the feed below the Facebook and on Wired's YouTube channel as well. And if you're heading over to Wired's YouTube channel, please subscribe so that you can rewatch all of the replays. We are doing our sessions live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. And you can always rewatch any of our replays on YouTube or Facebook. So if we can have another question from the audience, we have a question from Shay. He's on YouTube as well. How feasible is a regional grid to buy and sell various energy types? How feasible is a regional grid to buy and sell?
A regional grid, you're talking about most likely, I suspect, a virtual grid. I'm not sure. I think it would be a very interesting exercise. You know, in many other regions of the world, as I have worked in Central American, the Andean countries, Central America, they have a physical interconnection. So they have regional markets, just like in Europe. So the grid in the country it's a shared grid. So there's a lot of interaction. It's very feasible. The main issue for the Caribbean is because it's all different islands. It's a fragmented grid. And to have underwater cable, it's not cheap. So it would be very problematic. And if you're talking about a virtual grid in which you can maximize some of the resources, it would have to develop regional markets and projects so you could coordinate at the regional level, if that's what you're saying. But physical, it's not necessarily feasible because to connect all the islands in the Caribbean with underwater cables, I'm not sure if that would be the most cost-effective or resilient strategy.
Okay, that's good. We have some more questions. Our next question is from Andrew Simpson on Facebook. In an environment of limited foreign exchange, how can institutions such as yours assist with spreading the payments of renewable energy equipment? So I think he's the cost of the outlay of the equipment required. So I'm guessing that Andrew is asking about spreading out those payments in terms of maybe financial loans, things like that.
Sure.
Touched a bit on that already, but
I would suggest you look into the Smart Fund too, and all the benefits that gives, besides giving a substantial lower interest rate to help this small business to really get a kickstart. These funds is not to develop projects for well-established businesses that could access finance from any commercial bank. It's for those ones that are having difficulties, has a huge potential, but has some difficulties in terms of accessing the capital. A mechanism such as the Smart Fund, it's the sort of projects that we do, a development bank does. You know, you have a much lower interest. You provide free technical assistance to design all the technical and financial aspects of your project and give you all the advice on what project is the most suitable for your business. But also the repayment period, it's about up to 10 years, which is unheard of in a traditional financial sector. And why all these benefits, all these flexibilities is really to support the businesses to develop those projects that they would not be able to develop otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So I actually know Andrew has, he's a bit of a key player in the renewable energy sector. He has some very innovative small scale and medium scale renewable energy sources that he's been working on for quite some time. So he's on our team.
Excellent. It looks like we are on the same team then.
We're on the same team, yes. Do we have some more questions from the audience? We have one from Jerome on Facebook. Jerome, I'd like to know about the benefits of decentralized energy production and provision in Barbados. Can a microgrid modules assist us in building resilience?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's more and more, because I think we have been talking about microgrids or mini grids for a very long time, and sometimes people couldn't really see the benefits of investing in such projects or in such strategies. But this is not something that the government is not necessarily looking to for quite some time in doing it. One of the projects that we have been developing for quite some time is on the provision of renewable energy to public buildings and energy efficiency intervention. And that, and some of the buildings, we're making them, because it's not just, you can make a community, a group of houses, or specific services like hospital. When you design a project, an intervention for a hospital or for schools that it can serve as a shelter, you look at it as a mini grid, because you want to make sure that that system, whatever you want to call mini grid, microgrid, would operate regardless of any failure in the grid. So when we think about, it's not only about making those specific critical services resilient or ready to go, it's also looking to take the map of Barbados and you look, where are the population? Do you have all the shelters that spread across the island evenly? Because in case something happens, people need to go to specific areas. What are the critical services? Are we talking about hospitals, clinics? Are we talking about school for shelters? Are we talking about water? Right? Because we know without electricity to pump the water, you also don't have water if you don't have electricity. So when you look into making systems resilient, you think about microgrids, mini grids, but it's very important because you can develop them in a very interesting way to. Sorry, someone is sending me emails. Yes, you can develop in a very integrated way, or they. How can I say? Fragmented together in a fragmented way.
Excellent. So we've talked about so many different options here. Microgrids, I call it a maxi grid that Shay was suggesting, a regional one. There's lots of different opportunities out there. We have one more question, which is from Kevin Devonish, and I'll just read it out.
Kevin.
He says, hi, Veronica. One of the points of concern for the hotel industry for renewable energy projects is the need of security for loans for their renewable energy projects. Various hotels and businesses are already existing in arrangements which are not able to access this capital. In the future designed funds, is there any consideration to get around this?
Projects.
So I believe what he's speaking about is hotels which exist in arrangements where they are unable to access the current funds in their current structure. So are there funds which are designed with consideration to those entities to get around the whatever it is that's disqualifying them currently?
Well, I think, Kevin, we work together in many different projects. It's a very good question. And I think it's all about designing different opportunities, different strategies. I think one of the strategies that we talked about it that I'm not sure to what extent is popular is the ESCO. It's a firm that provides energy related services. They can borrow some capital and they can go to a group of 10 different hotels that would not have the financial muscle to go on their own and borrow the funds. So I think ESCO in that case would be, I think, a suitable strategy, because I know that there's so many hotels that they're so small that perhaps the operational cost for even doing the transaction would not be cost effective. So if you could put some of the hotel and businesses together and provide an integrated solution, I think that could be feasible. And I think something that we've been looking to possible test it out under the Smart Fund too. We should have more discussions on that, Kevin.
That's great. We have so many questions that we would just want to make sure that we're getting to as many of them as we can. So we'll just take the one last question before we unfortunately have to draw this lovely conversation to an end. So Michael, he would like to know, what ways can renewable be encouraged in islands around the Caribbean outside of Barbados? Is government the only route, or are there other routes?
I mean, I think there are many routes. I don't think it's one on the other, but you need to have some sort of legislation or regulation that would allow you to develop the project. You need a set of incentives. You need to make sure that you can import all the parts. You need to make sure that you have qualified workforce in the country. And you're going to develop projects. So you need to look into IPPs being allowed in the country. It is in most of the Caribbean islands. So there are many options out there. And I think sometimes the private sector wait for the government, or the government wait for the private sector. And sometimes in many countries, perhaps there's not a lot of interaction between the one and the other to talk about what they can do, what each one could do, and how they can develop projects. But I always feel like interesting projects always get developed one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So if you have ideas, just share those ideas or the projects with institutions that could provide you support in terms of developing such project.
Excellent, good advice. This has been a really great conversation today, Veronica. I want to really thank you for taking the time out to speak with all of us about all the different options. Just learning about how many different options there are out there, learning about the accessibility of the funds that are available, and the work that you're doing. We have a hopeful 2030 ahead of us. So I look forward to seeing all the innovation that'll come about, and a clean future for all of us. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. And if anyone has any interest to have more information, learn a lot more about what the bank is doing and working hand in hand with the government, just shoot me an email. My email is vprado@iadb.org.
Perfect. And you did mention a few links to some of the funds that were available today. If you have a chance to, maybe you can post those and in the discussion below so that everybody can have access to those, okay?
Absolutely. I'll share the link so everyone can access the documents or the links that I've mentioned.
Perfect. That'd be great. So thanks so much for joining us. You can join Wired's Keisha Farnham on Thursday, the 28th of May at 1 p.m. as she talks Silver Linings with Anate Mills, the consultant advisor to the Office of the Prime Minister in Jamaica, where she provides expert inputs on climate finance, transparency, and resiliency, as well as high-level coordination support for international climate events and engagement with international climate funds. And I will see you again next Tuesday, June the 2nd, where we have a very exciting trio of permaculture designers joining us to let you know why taking a permaculture design course was at the top of their list for both their professional and personal goals. So until next time, please stay home, wash your hands. Thanks so much for joining us.